If she's going to care for my father, the least she can do is speak. Claire Whitmore didn't raise her voice, but she didn't need to. The sentence cut clean through the soft piano drifting across the ballroom and settled over the room like a glass lid. Conversations thinned. A few guests turned without meaning to. Others pretended not to look, which only made the silence sharper. At the far end of the room, beneath the warm chandelier light and the pale gold shimmer of old money, Naomi Brooks stood beside Walter Whitmore's wheelchair with one hand resting lightly on the handle and the other folded over a small navy blanket on his lap. She wore simple black scrubs, neatly pressed, no jewelry except a plain watch, no expression anyone in that room could easily read. She did not answer. She only lowered her eyes for half a second, as if checking whether Walter's breathing had changed. The Whitmore estate in Westchester had been polished to perfection for the fundraiser. Crystal flutes glowed on silver trays. White roses floated in shallow bowls along the entryway. Through the 12-foot windows, the lawn rolled into darkness, trimmed so precisely it looked painted. Inside, every surface reflected light, marble, glass, lacquered wood, everything except Naomi. She seemed to absorb it. She had been in the house for 3 months, and still the family spoke about her as if she were a strange appliance they had never meant to buy. Efficient, quiet, necessary. Claire took a slow sip of champagne, then gave the faint smile of a woman certain the room agreed with her. "I'm not asking for a speech," she said, glancing at Evelyn, who stood beside her in a silk dress the color of cold cream. "Just basic warmth. My father isn't being cared for by a ghost." A few guests laughed politely, not because it was funny, but because people with money often mistook discomfort for wit. Naomi remained still. The piano player in the corner missed a note and quickly found his place again. Daniel Whitmore, tall and grave in a charcoal suit, stood near the fireplace with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around a lowball glass he hadn't touched in 10 minutes. He looked first at his sister, then at Naomi, then at the old man in the chair. Walter's chin had dipped slightly toward his chest. His once commanding face was softer now, the lines around his mouth deepened by illness and time. But the fingers of his right hand, thin and veined and unsteady, were curled into the edge of Naomi's sleeve. Not gripping hard, just enough to say don't move. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and didn't understand what they were seeing. Evelyn let out a measured breath. "It unsettles people," she said, her tone smooth as polished stone. "When someone spends every day in your home and never says more than 3 words. Naomi finally lifted her head. The chandelier light touched the high planes of her face, the calm in it almost impossible to misread if anyone there had truly wanted to. She looked at Claire, not defiant, not wounded, simply present. Then she adjusted the blanket over Walter's knees by less than an inch and said nothing at all. And somehow that was what made the room go still. Daniel set his glass down on the mantel with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The room had that strange hush expensive houses often carried, when something true had slipped out by accident and no one knew how to put it back. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a cold March rain had started to mist across the rear terrace, silvering the stone and turning the garden lights into blurred halos. Inside, the heat was perfect, the candles steady, the waiters silent, but the comfort in the room had thinned. Walter Whitmore shifted in his wheelchair, only slightly, yet Naomi felt it before anyone else did. She always did. The change was small, almost invisible, just a tightening at the corner of his mouth, a faint tremor in the fingers resting on her sleeve, a breath that came a little too shallow. She bent without ceremony and adjusted the angle of the blanket over his knees, then touched 2 fingers lightly to the inside of his wrist. Not checking the pulse exactly, feeling the rhythm of him. Daniel watched her do it. He had been watching her for weeks, though never in a way that felt kind. More like a man staring at a locked door, convinced there had to be a key and irritated that no one had handed it to him. He knew facts about Naomi Brooks because facts were easy to file. 34 years old. Licensed home health aide. Lives in Yonkers. No spouse listed. No children on record. Excellent references. No social media worth mentioning. He knew she arrived every morning at 6:45, brewed his father's tea the same way every time, folded washcloths with sharp, even corners, and kept a small black notebook in the pocket of her scrub top, where she wrote things down in neat, narrow print. He knew his father, who had dismissed 3 private nurses, 2 physical therapists, and 1 highly recommended memory care specialist in less than 7 weeks, had stopped refusing his medication after Naomi's second day in the house. He knew all of that, and still her silence bothered him because it gave him nothing to control. Claire crossed one heel over the other and let her bracelet slide down her wrist with a glittering whisper. "You see," she said to no one and everyone. "That is exactly what I mean. She just stands there like she is above all of us." Naomi did not look at her this time. Her attention stayed on Walter, whose breathing had begun to roughen almost too softly to hear. Evelyn noticed it then and frowned. "Is he all right?" she asked, suddenly more sincere than she had been all evening. Naomi reached down and straightened the oxygen tube near the collar of Walter's cardigan, then glanced toward the far corner of the room where the pianist sat under a brass floor lamp. "Stop the music," she said. Her voice was low, even, and so unexpected that the words seemed to strike the air instead of moving through it. The young man at the piano froze with his hands above the keys. Claire blinked. "Excuse me." Naomi lifted her head. "Please stop the music now." Something in the way she said it made Daniel turn fully toward his father. Walter's eyes were open, but they did not seem to settle on anything in the room. The soft piano melody that had sounded elegant a minute ago now seemed to skim over his skin like static. His hand tightened on Naomi's sleeve. Daniel felt a slow, unwelcome drop in his stomach. For the first time that evening, he realized his father was not merely tired. He was trying not to come apart. The pianist let his hands fall from the keys, and the last note dissolved into the crystal air like breath against glass. The difference was immediate. Walter's shoulders, which had been tightening by the second beneath his dark wool cardigan, eased by a fraction. Naomi lowered herself to one knee beside his chair, not hurried, not dramatic, only precise. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, her voice pitched low enough that it did not ask the room for permission, "you are here with me." Her hand hovered near his forearm until he turned toward it on his own. Then she touched him lightly, just above the wrist, and began tapping a slow, steady rhythm with 2 fingers. Once, twice, 3 times. Wait. Again. Around them, no one moved. The rain whispered against the terrace doors. Somewhere near the back hallway, a server set down a tray, and even that tiny sound made Claire flinch. Walter blinked hard, his eyes cloudy with the kind of fear that did not come from the present. He had once filled courtrooms without raising his voice. At 78, even after the stroke and the creeping damage that had frayed his memory into loose threads, there were still moments when the old force in him flashed like distant lightning. But tonight was not one of those moments. Tonight he looked smaller than the custom wool blanket over his knees, smaller than the carved chair, smaller than the room built to impress other rich people. Naomi kept tapping. Daniel had never noticed before how little she asked from his father. Everyone else in the house seemed to approach Walter as if he were either a fragile project or a problem to solve. Doctors wanted responses. Therapists wanted effort. Family wanted recognition, names, eye contact, some sign that the man they remembered was still standing behind those fading eyes. Naomi never seemed to demand any of that. She only watched, adjusted, waited, and somehow that waiting had a shape to it, almost like skill. "Dad," Daniel said carefully, taking one step forward. Walter's chin jerked at the sound, and Naomi lifted one hand without looking up. Not rude, not fearful, just a small, unmistakable signal to stop. Daniel halted where he was, startled less by the gesture than by the fact that he obeyed it. Naomi leaned closer to Walter and changed the rhythm. 3 taps, then a pause, then one long stroke over the back of his hand. His breathing, which had gone thin and uneven, began to lengthen. The terrible strained look around his mouth loosened. "Too much sound," she said quietly, more to Daniel than to anyone else. "Too many people too close." Claire gave a short, disbelieving laugh that died almost as soon as it left her. It was piano music. Naomi finally looked up. Her face held no anger, which somehow made the moment land harder. "To you," she said. Daniel felt the words settle into him with uncomfortable force. "To you." Not to Walter, whose hearing had grown strange since the stroke, catching certain frequencies like barbed wire and letting others drift past untouched. Not to the old man whose bad nights often started with a slammed cabinet, a television left too loud, the scrape of chairs across hardwood. Daniel knew these things in fragments because someone had written them in reports and mentioned them in clipped updates. Naomi knew them the way people know weather in their bones. Walter's fingers loosened from the fabric of her sleeve and turned, slowly, until they found her hand instead. He held it there, trembling but certain. Then, after several long seconds, he drew one fuller breath and let it out. The room did not feel elegant anymore. It felt exposed. And in that silence, with the candles burning low and the smell of rain pressing faintly through old glass, Daniel Whitmore understood something that made his chest tighten for reasons he could not yet name. Naomi had not been standing apart from them all evening. She had been standing guard. Claire recovered first, though only on the surface. People like Claire Whitmore had spent their entire lives learning how to smooth over embarrassment before it could stain the furniture. She lifted her chin, adjusted the stem of her glass between two manicured fingers, and gave the nearest guests a thin smile that asked them to agree this had all been minor, manageable, forgettable. "My father has been overly sensitive since the winter," she said, as if the trembling in Walter's hand and the drained color in his face were simply an inconvenience in the schedule of the evening. "It is nothing serious." But the room did not quite believe her now. Not after seeing Naomi kneel beside him like someone who knew the map of his fear better than his own children did. A couple near the terrace looked away politely. One of Daniel's business associates set his drink down untouched. The fundraiser had not ended, but it had cracked, and everyone could feel the line running through it. Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice in that controlled, expensive way that somehow made every word sharper. "Daniel, perhaps we should take your father upstairs before this becomes more awkward." Naomi did not rise. Her fingers still rested on Walter's wrist, measuring the quiet return of him. "Not yet," she said. Daniel turned to her. "Why not?" It came out more quickly than he intended, more challenge than question. Naomi glanced at the front of the room where a pair of waiters were collecting empty glasses, at the floral arrangements, at the guests standing in little islands of discomfort under the chandeliers. "Because if you move him now, all he will feel is motion and noise," she said. "He is just starting to settle." Claire let out a breath through her nose, the sound almost a laugh. "You always talk as if no one else in this house knows anything." Naomi looked at her then, calm as still water. "I talk when it matters." For a second, even Claire had nothing. Daniel felt the truth of that land harder than he wanted it to. Naomi almost never spoke, and yet every time she did, the room seemed to rearrange itself around the fact that she was right. He hated how much that unsettled him. He hated even more that his father, who often drifted through the day in fragments and fog, seemed to understand her without being told. Walter's breathing had steadied now. His eyes, still tired, had found Naomi's face and stayed there. Daniel had seen that same look only once before in the last 6 months, on an old home video when his mother had leaned down beside Walter at a summer picnic and said something no one else could hear. "Trust," Daniel thought suddenly, and the word made something in his chest pull tight. "Clear the musicians from this room," he said at last, not taking his eyes off his father. "And tell the catering staff to keep service in the West Hall." Claire stared at him. "You are reorganizing my event because she said so?" "Because he needs it," Daniel replied. The answer surprised both of them. Naomi lowered her gaze again, not pleased, not triumphant, simply attentive. The rain deepened beyond the glass, soft and gray over the lawn, and the candles along the mantel burned lower in their brass cups. Guests began drifting toward the adjoining hall, their voices quieter now, shoes muted against the runner rugs. The ballroom emptied by inches. With every person who left, Walter's shoulders dropped a little more. Naomi did not move from beside him. She stayed exactly where she was, steady and unadorned in the center of all that wealth, while the Whitmore family stood around her realizing, one by one, that the least powerful person in the house was the only one who knew what to do. By 9:15, the ballroom had lost its performance. The donors had migrated to the West Hall where the lighting was softer, the voices lower, and the story could be retold in smaller, safer versions. In the main room, only the candlelight remained steady. Rain ticked against the long panes of glass in a patient, whispering rhythm, and the smell of peonies and polished wood hung in the air like something too expensive to be real. Walter sat with his head tilted slightly toward Naomi, his breathing no longer strained, but still fragile enough that every shift in the room seemed to matter. Daniel crouched a few feet away now, close enough to see the pale grooves age had carved into his father's hands, close enough to notice how those hands stopped trembling when Naomi rested her palm over them. He had spent months paying specialists by the hour, reviewing treatment plans, reading clinical notes late at night in the blue light of his study, and yet none of that had prepared him for the strange, almost humiliating simplicity of what he was seeing. No machine, no lecture, no display of expertise. Just Naomi, kneeling on an Aubusson rug that probably cost more than her monthly rent, counting his father back into the room one quiet breath at a time. Claire lingered by the bar cart with her glass untouched, her expression caught between annoyance and discomfort. She had built this evening around image, around names, around the seamless machinery of wealth appearing generous under chandelier light. The last thing she could tolerate was the suggestion that the only person who truly understood Walter was the woman she had reduced, in front of half the county, to a problem in uniform. "This cannot go on like this," she said finally, keeping her voice low enough to sound controlled and high enough to be heard. "We cannot keep rearranging the house around her preferences." Naomi did not look up. "They are not my preferences," she said. Claire gave a tight smile. "Then what are they?" Naomi lifted her eyes, and for a moment Daniel thought how tired she looked. Not weak, not defeated, just tired in a way that came from carrying yourself carefully in rooms where people had already decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth. "They are his limits," she said. The words settled over the room with no more force than falling ash, but Claire's face changed. Evelyn folded her arms, her bracelets clicking softly against one another. "How would you know his limits better than his family?" she asked. Naomi looked back at Walter before answering, as if the truth mattered more when she kept it close to him. "Because I pay attention when he shows them." Daniel felt the sting of that, because there was nothing theatrical in it. No accusation, just fact. He thought of the mornings he had rushed through the breakfast room with his phone in one hand and an apology in the other, kissing his father's temple while already thinking about conference calls in Chicago or Tokyo. He thought of Claire insisting Walter loved live music because he used to sponsor the Philharmonic. He thought of Evelyn saying his confusion was worse when the weather changed, as if the mind could be explained by the forecast. Naomi had never offered theories. She watched, recorded, adjusted. The small black notebook in her scrub pocket suddenly came back to him with new weight. It was not a habit. It was a map. Walter stirred, his eyes drifting open a little wider now, and his gaze moved from Naomi to Daniel. For one suspended second, recognition flickered there. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, hope catching in his throat so fast it almost hurt. But Walter did not speak. He only looked at his son, then back at Naomi, and settled again as though the choice between them required no thought at all. Daniel sat very still. Across the room, thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the Hudson, low and distant, and in the hush that followed, he understood something he had been resisting all night. Naomi had not made herself essential to his father. His father had chosen her. At 9:28, the last cluster of donors drifted out of the ballroom with their softened voices and careful smiles, and the house seemed to exhale around them. A server pulled the double doors halfway closed, muting the clink of glassware from the West Hall, and the silence that settled afterward felt less like emptiness than relief. Naomi waded through all of it without shifting her posture. She had learned a long time ago that some moments only held if no one rushed to fill them. Walter's hand still rested inside hers, lighter now, the tremor fading to a faint, uneven flutter. His eyes had half closed, not in sleep, but in that fragile middle place where the world could still turn sharp if touched the wrong way. Daniel rose slowly from his crouch, his knees stiff from the rug, and looked toward the mantel clock as though time itself might tell him what a son was supposed to do next. "Should we take him upstairs now?" he asked. Naomi listened before answering. Not to Daniel. To Walter. To the room. To the air pressing soft and damp against the windows. "In a minute," she said. "Let his body believe the room is safe first." Claire gave a short breath that was almost a scoff, but it lacked its earlier confidence. "You make it sound as if the house is attacking him." Naomi did not answer immediately. She reached for the navy blanket, smoothing one corner where it had folded under Walter's wrist. "No," she said at last. "Just loud. Evelyn turned toward Daniel with the faint impatience of someone accustomed to being obeyed in smaller matters and deferred to in larger ones. This is not sustainable. We cannot be held hostage by every sound in our own home. Daniel did not answer her. He was watching Naomi again, but differently now. Not as a problem, not even as a mystery, more like a witness to something he had missed while standing inside it. What happens if we move him too soon? He asked. Naomi looked up. The chandelier light caught the plain face of her watch, the crisp edge of her collar, the exhaustion tucked carefully behind her composure. His heart rate jumps. He stops tracking where he is. Tonight, with the weather and the crowd, he could spiral for hours. Claire folded her arms. You speak as if you were a neurologist. Naomi's expression did not change. No, she said. I speak like the person who is here when the neurologist goes home. The words were quiet, but Daniel felt them land with almost physical force. Because that was it, was not it. The specialists came in polished shoes and left with leather briefcases and invoices. Claire visited when it suited her calendar. Evelyn offered advice from doorways and charity lunches. Daniel managed schedules, medications, insurance authorizations, staffing. All useful, all necessary. But Naomi was the one there at 2:14 in the morning when Walter forgot the year and thought the radiator hiss was a train platform. Naomi was the one who noticed when the seams of his socks bothered him, when overhead lights made him flinch, when he needed soup instead of solid food, because swallowing had become a secret labor he was too proud to name. The realization came over Daniel slowly and all at once, like cold rain finding a gap in a coat. Walter stirred again, then lifted his head by less than an inch. His lips parted. For one stunned second, everyone in the room leaned toward him. His voice, when it came, was thin and worn at the edges, but unmistakably clear. Naomi, he whispered. Just her name. Nothing more. Yet Claire went still. Evelyn's hands dropped from where they had been folded across her chest. Daniel looked at his father as though he had just heard a language return from the dead. Walter had not said a name unprompted in 11 days. Naomi bent closer, her hand still around his. I am here, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Walter's breathing loosened again at the sound of her voice, and Daniel understood with a deep, private shame that his father had not been reaching toward silence all this time. He had been reaching toward the one person in the house who knew how to make it gentle. For several seconds, no one in the ballroom trusted their own hearing. Walter's voice had been so thin, so worn down by illness and distance, that his single whispered word seemed less spoken than returned, as if it had traveled a long way to reach them. Naomi did not react with surprise. That, more than anything, unsettled Claire. She had spent the better part of a year chasing signs from her father like a woman trying to catch reflections in moving water. A blink that resembled recognition. A half smile. A syllable that could be mistaken for a name if you wanted it badly enough. But Naomi only bowed her head a little closer and answered him as if this were not rare at all, as if she had been meeting him in this fragile place for weeks and had no need to turn it into a performance. I am here, she said again, the words low and steady, and Walter's fingers tightened once around hers before easing open. Claire set her glass down too fast on the bar card, the crystal ringing against silver. That is impossible, she said. The sharpness in her voice broke the room's hush, and Walter's brow twitched at the sound. Naomi felt it immediately. She shifted slightly, placing herself between him and the rest of the room without seeming to. Please, she said, not looking up. Lower your voice. Claire stared at her, color rising high in her face. Do not tell me how to speak in my own house. Daniel turned. Claire. It was just her name, but something in his tone made Evelyn glance at him. He had not sounded like that in months. Not tired. Not diplomatic. Not willing to smooth everyone back into comfort. Claire looked from her brother to Naomi and let out a breath that trembled on the edge of indignation. This is exactly what I have been saying all night. She acts as if she runs this family. Naomi finally raised her eyes. There was no challenge in them. Only fatigue, and something steadier underneath it. No, she said. I act like he matters more than our pride. The sentence fell clean and hard into the room. Evelyn's lips parted, then closed again. Daniel felt the air change, as surely as he had felt the storm deepening outside. There it was, stripped of etiquette and candlelight and donor names. The truth no one in the family had wanted spoken aloud by the woman in scrubs. Walter had become, in ways both visible and quiet, secondary to the effort of managing his decline. His schedule, his staffing, his insurance appeals, his moods, his disruptions. Even their concern for him had become organized around inconvenience. Naomi turned back to Walter, as if the conversation behind her had already lost importance. She touched the edge of his cardigan near the collarbone. Two light adjustments Daniel barely understood, but somehow trusted now. Then lifted a cup with a flexible straw from the side table. "One sip," she murmured. Walter obeyed. Claire watched that tiny act with a look Daniel could not read at first. Then he understood. It was not only resentment. It was grief humiliated by comparison. Naomi was doing, with no blood relation and no polished speech, what Claire had wanted desperately to believe only family could do. Rain slid down the tall windows in silver threads. The candles on the mantel burned lower, and the room smelled faintly of wax and wet earth drifting in through an old frame near the terrace door. Daniel stepped closer to his father's chair, but this time he did not reach for him immediately. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Naomi looked up at him, surprised perhaps not by the question itself, but by the fact that he meant it. Walter's eyes had closed again, calmer now, his breathing deep and even beneath the blanket. Naomi answered after a moment. "Less proving," she said softly. "More listening." The words stayed in the air after Naomi said them, quiet but impossible to step around. Less proving, more listening. Claire looked away first, toward the rain-glazed windows, where the terrace lights had turned the glass into dark mirrors. Evelyn pressed her lips together and smoothed an invisible crease from the front of her dress, the motion of someone who did not know where to place her hands when certainty had left the room. Daniel stood beside his father's chair with the strange stillness of a man hearing instructions in a language he should have learned years ago. "Tell us what that looks like," he said. Naomi glanced down at Walter, whose breathing had settled into a deeper rhythm now, the rough edge finally gone. "It looks like no sudden movement," she said. "No questions. No trying to make him perform because you are relieved. Keep the lights low when we take him upstairs. No television in his room tonight. No one crowds the doorway." Claire gave a short, wounded laugh. "You make us sound like strangers." Naomi adjusted the blanket one last time and rose from the rug in one smooth motion, slower now, as if she had been kneeling longer than any of them realized. "Sometimes strangers are quieter," she said. Daniel looked at her sharply, but there was no cruelty in her tone, only a tired honesty that left no room for offense unless offense was all someone had. He nodded once. "Fine," he said, then more firmly, to the room this time. "Do exactly what she says." The sentence changed something, not because the others agreed, but because Daniel had finally said aloud what the evening had been resisting from the start. Naomi moved to the back of Walter's chair and loosened the wheel locks. The soft click sounded small under the chandeliers. Walter stirred, his fingers brushing the armrest as if testing whether the world beneath him had changed. "We are going upstairs now, Mr. Whitmore," Naomi said. Slowly. He did not answer, but his shoulders did not tighten. Daniel walked ahead and dimmed the sconces along the hallway leading to the elevator alcove. One by one, the bright reflections faded from the marble floor until the path looked warmer, gentler, more like a home than a museum. Claire watched him do it with open disbelief. She had spent years in this house and had never once considered the light itself could be too loud. The ride upstairs took less than a minute, but it seemed longer. The elevator hummed softly. Rain traced the narrow glass pane in the brass door. Walter kept his gaze fixed on Naomi's hand where it rested near his shoulder, as though that single point of stillness mattered more than walls, floors, or family. On the third floor, the air felt different. Colder by a degree or two. Quieter. The corridor outside Walter's suite smelled faintly of cedar, starch, and the lavender sachets the housekeeper tucked into the linen closet every spring. Naomi guided the chair toward his room, where one lamp had already been left on low beside the bed. Everything inside was arranged with a discipline Daniel recognized now as hers. Medications sorted by hour. Water measured in a covered glass. Slippers placed exactly parallel to the bed. And on the small side table beside a stack of neatly folded washcloths sat Naomi's black notebook, its corners worn smooth from use. As she reached for it, Daniel's eyes caught a page left slightly open beneath the elastic band. In the narrow, careful handwriting, He saw his father's name followed by a line he could not stop reading. Loud rooms make him search for exits. Quiet helps him remember there is none he needs. Daniel stood very still in the doorway, the words hitting him harder than anything spoken downstairs, because for the first time he understood that Naomi had not just been caring for his father. She had been studying his fear. Daniel did not mean to keep staring at the notebook, but the line on the page held him there with a force that felt almost private. Loud rooms make him search for exits. Quiet helps him remember there is none he needs. The handwriting was narrow, careful, almost severe in its neatness, and beneath that sentence were others, dated and timed in the same black ink. March 3rd, 7:18 p.m. Agitation increased after 2 guests arrived unannounced. Reduced overhead lights. Offered warm water. Recovery in 11 minutes. March 9th, 2:07 a.m. Woke disoriented. Believed he was late for court. Did not correct immediately. Redirected with robe, slippers, and familiar scent. Recovery in 19 minutes. March 14th, 6:42 a.m. Refused breakfast when radio was left on in kitchen. Accepted oatmeal after silence restored. Daniel read the entries without turning the page, as if doing anything more would feel like trespass. Yet what he had already seen was enough to unsettle something deep in him. This was not guesswork, not instinct dressed up as confidence. It was observation, pattern, patience, the slow gathering of details no one else in the family had taken the time to notice. Behind him, Claire stopped in the doorway and gave the room a quick, uneasy glance. Walter's suite had never looked like this under her eye, not because it had changed, but because she was finally seeing what had been there all along. The lamp by the bed was set low. The curtains were drawn halfway to soften the reflection of rain off the terrace. A small bowl of peppermint lozenges sat untouched beside a folded hand towel. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner had been stopped, its pendulum still. Claire noticed that first. "Why is the clock off?" she asked. Naomi was helping Walter out of his cardigan, her movements slow and respectful, each step announced before it happened. Because the ticking made him think someone was knocking, she said. Claire frowned. That was his favorite clock. Naomi did not argue. She only took the cardigan from Walter's shoulders and laid it over the arm of a chair. "It was," she said quietly. Daniel looked back at the notebook. The dates went farther than he expected. Page after page. Weeks of detail. No self-pity. No commentary. Only what helped, what harmed, what soothed, what made the night longer. He turned one page before he could stop himself. Near the top, in the same steady hand, another line waited for him. He responds better when given dignity before instruction. Daniel exhaled, but it did not feel like enough air. He thought of all the times he had entered this room, carrying urgency like authority. "Sit up, Dad. Take this now. We need to do your exercises before the therapist gets here." Small commands, efficient and practical, the language of management. Not once had he asked himself whether his father still needed to be approached like a man instead of handled like a schedule. "How long have you been keeping these?" he asked. Naomi tucked the blanket over Walter's legs and checked the oxygen line near his shoulder before answering. "Since my 3rd day." Daniel looked up. "Why?" Naomi met his eyes for a moment, and there was no accusation in her face. Only a level honesty that made him wish there were. Because no one else was writing down what scared him. The room went still again. Claire's expression flickered, then hardened, then faltered. On the bed, Walter had begun to settle against the pillows, his eyes heavy now, the sharpness of the evening receding from his face. Naomi reached for a warm washcloth from the tray by the sink and placed it gently in his hands, something soft to anchor him. He held it without question. Daniel looked from the notebook to his father to Naomi, and a thought came to him, so clearly it felt like shame. They had hired her to watch Walter. What she had actually been doing was remembering him. The silence in Walter's room was different now. It no longer felt strained or waiting to break. It felt arranged, protected, almost held in place by the small steady things Naomi had done without ever announcing them. The lamp cast a warm circle across the quilt. Rain moved softly against the windows. Walter lay back against the pillows with the washcloth still folded in his hands, his breathing deep enough now that each rise of his chest seemed to loosen the room by another inch. Daniel stood beside the side table with Naomi's notebook still open in his hand, and for the first time all evening, he felt embarrassed by how often he had mistaken quiet for absence. Before he could speak, Naomi's phone gave a brief vibration from the pocket of her scrub top. She glanced at the screen, then at Walter, then stepped toward the doorway before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Dr. Keller. He is stable now. Claire looked up at once. Daniel did too. Naomi listened for several seconds, her eyes on Walter the entire time. The music triggered it, she said softly. Too many voices layered over each other. I reduced the room, and he came back down in under 15 minutes. Daniel's grip tightened around the notebook. When Naomi ended the call, he spoke before he could think better of it. You called Dr. Keller? Naomi nodded once. I texted her when he first started escalating downstairs. Daniel stared at her. During the fundraiser? As soon as I saw the signs. Claire gave a short, incredulous laugh, though it had lost most of its edge. And she answers you on a Saturday night. Naomi looked from Claire to Daniel, then back at Walter. She usually does when it is about him. Something in that sentence made Daniel reach for his own phone almost automatically, as if to verify a reality he had somehow missed inside his own house. He scrolled to Dr. Susan Keller's name and pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, tired, unmistakably familiar. Daniel, I was just speaking with Naomi. He turned slightly away from the bed, though not enough to stop watching his father. You were aware she keeps notes like this? He looked down at the open pages in his hand. There was a pause on the line, and then Dr. Keller said, Daniel, half of the medication adjustments we have made in the last 6 weeks came from patterns Naomi documented before anyone else noticed them. He said nothing. Across the room, Claire's face had gone still. She records the timing of his confusion, the effect of lighting, food texture, sound. Exposure, emotional fatigue, Dr. Keller continued. That notebook is the most useful clinical information I get between visits. Frankly, I wish more trained staff were that observant. Daniel let the words settle with a heaviness that felt deserved. Why did no one tell me? He asked quietly. On the other end of the line, Dr. Keller exhaled. I assumed you knew. Naomi has been sending written summaries every week. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Weekly summaries. He could already picture them landing in his inbox between board updates, legal memos, investment forecasts, all the language of power he never failed to answer. He had probably skimmed the subject lines and told himself he would read them later. Later, in a house like this, had become a graveyard for important things. He lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. No one spoke. Naomi had gone back to Walter's bedside, where she adjusted the blanket by an inch and checked the oxygen line with the same care she had given everything else. No flourish. No satisfaction. Just work. Claire looked at her, then at the notebook, then away. Daniel remained where he was, rainlight silvering the window behind him, and understood at last that Naomi's silence had never been emptiness, never defiance, never indifference. It had been a tension so complete that it left no room for performance. Daniel set the notebook down with a care that felt nothing like the way he had picked it up. For a moment, he only stood there, one hand resting against the edge of the side table, the other hanging useless at his side, as if all the habits that had made him effective in every boardroom and negotiation room in his life had abandoned him in his father's bedroom. Claire was the first to speak, but even her voice had changed. The sharpness was still there, though dulled now by something less comfortable than anger. Why did you never say any of this? She asked. Naomi had just finished tucking the blanket more securely around Walter's legs. She straightened and turned toward them, the lamplight catching the tired shadows under her eyes. Because your father needed care, she said. Not my story. Claire looked at her for a long second, then at Walter asleep under the softened light, then back again. You let us think you were cold. Naomi's face did not harden. If anything, it grew quieter. No, she said. You decided that before you knew me. The truth of it landed so cleanly that no one in the room moved. Rain drifted against the glass in a light, steady hush. Somewhere farther down the hall, a door closed softly, and the house returned to stillness. Daniel pulled the chair from the writing desk and sat without taking his eyes off Naomi. Then let us know you now, he said. Naomi glanced at Walter first, as though asking permission from the sleeping man before offering anything of herself to the people standing around him. When she finally spoke, her voice stayed even, but there was an old weight in it, the kind carried so long it no longer needed to sound dramatic. My father died in hospice care 4 years ago, she said. Claire's expression shifted. Naomi kept going. He had heart failure. Near the end, people kept telling me to talk more. Encourage him. Read to him. Fill the silence so he would not be afraid. Nurses, cousins, church friends, everyone had advice. She looked down at her hands then, not wringing them, not performing grief, just remembering. One night I stepped out because a relative called and said I needed to explain another change in medication. I stood in the hallway trying to say the right thing to someone who was not even there, and when I came back in, my father was gone. The room did not react outwardly, but the air changed. Claire lowered her eyes. Evelyn's folded arms loosened. Daniel sat very still, hearing not only the loss in Naomi's words but the discipline that had grown around it. After that, Naomi said, I stopped believing every silence had to be filled. Some people are not asking for noise. They are asking not to be left alone inside what hurts. Your father is like that. He does not always need words. He needs someone who will stay without making his fear louder. Daniel felt the sentence move through him with slow, painful clarity. Every rushed instruction, every bright reassurance, every attempt to drag his father toward normalcy suddenly looked thin beside what Naomi was describing. Not treatment. Presence. Not correction. Company. Claire lifted her head, and for the first time all night there was no defense left in her face, only the stunned shame of someone. Realizing how quickly she had mistaken dignity for distance, Naomi turned back toward Walter and adjusted the corner of the blanket by less than an inch. I am not silent because I do not care, she said softly. I am careful because I do. No one answered her right away. There was too much truth in the room now, and truth had a way of making wealthy people feel suddenly awkward inside their own polished lives. Daniel looked down at his hands, at the faint crease where he had been gripping the notebook too hard, and then over at his father sleeping beneath the low amber light. The rain had softened outside, no longer tapping insistently at the windows but sliding down them in long quiet threads. The whole house seemed to have lowered its voice. Even the air in Walter's room felt gentler, warmed by the lamp, the folded quilt, the faint lavender from the linen closet, the steady hum of oxygen moving where it was needed and nowhere else. Claire stepped closer to the bed, though carefully now, as if afraid to disturb more than the mattress springs. Her face had lost all of its practiced brightness. Without the chandelier light, without the crowd, without the performance of hosting, she looked older somehow, not in years but in regret. Naomi, she said, and her voice caught a little on the second syllable. Naomi turned, waiting. Claire swallowed. I was wrong about you. The sentence came out smaller than Claire usually allowed anything to be, but that was what made it sound real. Naomi did not rush to soften it for her. She only nodded once, as if accepting the words without demanding more. Daniel rose from the desk chair and came to stand at the foot of the bed. He looked at Naomi for a long moment, then at the notebook, then back to her again. I should have known, he said quietly. I should have read what you sent. I should have seen what was happening in my own house. Naomi's expression did not change much, but something in her eyes eased, just a little. You were trying to hold a lot together, she said. Daniel let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. That is not the same as paying attention. The words seemed to settle over. All of them. Evelyn, who had said almost nothing since Naomi told her story, reached out and straightened the edge of the curtain near the window, giving herself a task so she would not have to stand there empty-handed. Then, in the softened quiet, Walter moved. It was a small shift at first, just his fingers stirring against the washcloth in his hands. Naomi turned to him immediately and stepped to the bedside. His eyes opened slowly, not wide, but clear enough that all three of them straightened without meaning to. He looked from Naomi to Daniel, and then passed them all toward the corner of the room where his late wife's framed photograph stood on the dresser, half lit by the lamp. For a second his face held that searching look they all knew too well, the one that made hope painful. But then his gaze returned to Naomi, and something in him settled. His lips parted. The room went completely still. Quiet. He whispered first, as if trying the word before trusting the rest of the thought. Naomi leaned closer. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Walter's eyes remained on her, and when he spoke again his voice was thin, but the meaning in it was whole. She sounds, he murmured, pausing for breath. Like your mother when the room is quiet. Daniel closed his eyes at once. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. There was no mistaking what the old man meant. Not the pitch of Naomi's voice. Not the color of her skin. Not any surface thing at all. He meant the feeling of her. The safety. The way she made a room stop asking anything from pain except that it be held. Naomi lowered her head for a moment. Not in triumph. Not even in surprise. But with a tenderness so restrained it almost hurt to witness. Daniel opened his eyes again and looked at her differently now. Not as an employee, not as a stranger in his father's room, but as someone who had carried a piece of human decency into a house full of money and reminded them all what it sounded like. Morning came gently to the Whitmore house, as if even the sunlight had learned to lower its voice. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the terrace stones washed clean and the hedges shining with beads of water that caught the early light like scattered glass. Downstairs, the grand rooms that had glowed with wealth and discomfort the night before now stood quiet and ordinary, their polished surfaces pale in the soft gray of morning. The ballroom doors were open again. The flowers had begun to bow at the edges. A few empty glasses remained on a silver tray in the west hall, forgotten by staff too tired to care. In the kitchen, the scent of coffee rose warm and dark beside a skillet of eggs left on low heat. Naomi stood at the counter in fresh scrubs, measuring oatmeal into a small porcelain bowl with the same careful movements she used for everything else. No hurry, no waste, no sound beyond the spoon against the ceramic and the hum of the refrigerator. She had been up since 6:15. Walter had slept longer than usual. Only one brief waking at 3 in the morning. No confusion, no searching, just a hand reaching toward the chair beside his bed and settling again when he found her there. She wrote it down in the black notebook before sunrise, closed the cover, and began the day. She heard Daniel before she saw him. Not because he was loud, but because men like Daniel Whitmore usually entered rooms with direction already around them. And this morning he stepped into the kitchen like someone borrowing his own life back one careful inch at a time. He had removed his tie. His shirt sleeves were rolled once at the forearms. There was no phone in his hand. Naomi turned as he stopped a few feet from the counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The windows over the sink let in a clean stripe of morning light that fell across the marble island and the steam lifting from the oatmeal bowl. Daniel looked at her, not above her, not through her, but directly at her, and there was something unguarded in his face now that had not been there the night before. "I owe you an apology," he said. Naomi set the spoon down. Daniel glanced toward the hallway leading to the stairs, as if making sure the house remained as quiet as it felt. "Not just for last night," he said. "For the way we let you stand in this house and do the hardest work here while making you feel as if you had to defend your right to do it." Naomi listened without interrupting. Daniel swallowed once. "You protected my father. You respected him when the rest of us were too busy managing him. And I let your emails become something I would get to later." The last word stayed between them with the weight it deserved. Naomi's expression softened, though only slightly. "He still needs breakfast at 7:30, she said. It was not dismissal. It was grace in the only form she seemed to trust. Daniel let out a quiet breath and nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Some repairs were not made with speeches. He stepped closer to the counter. "Then let me carry the tray." Naomi looked at him for a second, measuring perhaps whether the offer came from guilt or from learning. Then she placed the folded napkin beside the bowl and handed him the tray. Together they walked upstairs through the softened light of the hallway, past family portraits and polished banisters, and the remains of a world that suddenly seemed less important than a warm breakfast and a quiet room. When Naomi opened Walter's door, he was awake, propped against the pillows, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. The stopped clock remained still in the corner. The lamp by the bed was still on low. Morning light rested across the quilt in a pale gold square. Walter looked first at Naomi, then at Daniel carrying the tray, and something like peace moved across his face. Not dramatic, not sudden, just real. Naomi stepped to the bedside and adjusted the blanket over his knees. Daniel set the tray down without clatter, exactly where she nodded. No one rushed to speak. No one asked Walter to prove who he was that morning. The room stayed quiet, warm with oatmeal and sunlight and the soft rhythm of breath. Walter lifted one hand from the blanket and laid it over Naomi's for a moment, then over Daniel's. And in that small, still room, with the rain gone and the house finally listening,